Pleasure to be here. So I'm going to just cover a little bit, starting, with the morphospace from a historical perspective, and then various ways that people have used to, look at how it can evolve, particularly relating to the things that happened sort of in the first lecture, and most specifically how we can possibly formalize the language of form itself. I'm also affiliated with SEMF, and just a general outline we're going to cover. So we'll go over the research program from the last presentation again, talk about some of the key philosophical questions that are embedded in it, the kind of etymology and evolution of morphospace, concept of empiricism specifically related to that, specifically what the Levin Lab has done. Obviously, most people will be quite familiar with that here on this, so I won't go that much. But then thinking about Bayesian thinking, knowledge graphs, how they intersect, how they're currently used in science, a little bit about probabilistic knowledge graphs, and then beauty and form, which I think we'll find out is actually not much of a, is not really a side topic, and then kind of where we go from here. I'll go through a lot of things quickly, but we'll have time for questions at the end. So just to recap some of the research program as it was already put out, we're talking here really about the first, second, and last things here a little bit. Both what are the new interfaces that could be made that would observe these ingressing forms, and the concept of this sort of synthetic morphology work. Obviously, we don't have full access to what Professor Levin has been putting out most recently, so we're waiting, I guess, in a way, those of us who are a little bit on the outside. And then this rigorous mapping between properties of pointers and the patterns they facilitate, very kind of important. And then particularly, what can we really say realistically about this Platonic space? I'm not going to assume necessarily the outset that it exists, but we'll sort of go through that. And methodologically, so this is, my background is a little bit formal philosophy training, also religious studies, and, particularly when people, and then a little bit applied computer science, more on actually building things, back end of database design as it pertains to other things. So the most recent work I've been doing is actually specifically for people involved in both psychedelic and spiritual studies, and I helped set up the Contemplative Studies Initiative, particularly back end stuff at Brown University quite a while ago. What in all these claims that is made is actually empirically verified, and how is empirically verified. So, with something like meditation, you can often say you have random controls trial, people have anxiety reduction, etc. That's usually sufficient for, getting past insurance things in the US, and that's one thing that people look at. But obviously there's a lot other, and this is more the sort of pure biology version, which is frankly not my expertise. But hopefully I will lean a little bit on my expertise as we go through this. So what do we know? Just in general, and with a strong sense, this is where the Bayesian stuff comes important. How can we extend this knowledge? And then if we find edge case, for example, as Michael Levin has suggested, that there's ingress or phenomena that's not covered in one of these formal systems, how can we involve the system without introducing fuzzy logic? Use that in a sort of vague general sense, but it is one of the problems that's usually attributed to the classic Platonisms, that basically they over-specify things that we don't have clear evidence for. And I think more or less this has been a critique going all the way back to Aristotle. So, and there's many, many different versions of it. And then more specifically related to SEMP, we have an interest, I think, in creating seminar series to educate people more broadly, and interact with a lot of people who are interested in these things. So how can we actually take this very specifically, introduce the knowledge to other people who might be able to do something with it, whether they're mid-career professionals or, math PhD students or what have you. And that's sort of already what's happening under that umbrella. So going to Morphospace and how this kind of concept got established, my last book for MIT Press was really on history of technology, but it went into pretty heavy philosophical topics because people are motivated by these things. So I think it's interesting sometimes to talk about the psychology of motivation. But Darcy Thompson, who was covered last time, really interesting mathematician who went into a lot of different things about math and where it intersects sort of other fields, and particularly biology. And he was doing this really all by hand, interestingly enough, in these little diagrams of how the kind of morphology of these things. But he very specifically said he was indebted to three people: Galileo, Albrecht Dürer, and Goethe. Now, Goethe really originated this stuff in 1786 when he was traveling around in the Alps, and he noted variations between different, what seemed to be the same species at different altitudes. And he started noting this, and then he, developed this concept a little bit, and was quite disappointed not to be taken seriously as a scientist, more or less in his lifetime and afterwards. And so he's primarily known as an artist, but he did have this concept, basically, that there is this original morphology, and that is the term basically when Darcy Thompson takes it is specifically from Goethe. So and then we go into Wright and kind of looking at the selective evolution. Later on with the kind of respect to another form of the sort of morphospace and genome and kind of morphogens. Then in Turing, you have the chemical basis of morphogenesis. So this is specifically the morphogens as it pertains to something like stripes or how they might evolve. He was able to model this. I was able to duplicate some of his code here. So you see, like literally, this is one of these things evolving basically with respect to certain morphogens. And then Raup, who we'll sort of cover in more depth, it's a pretty important thing actually here. If you just see what is in the black, obviously Levin uses this in some of his as well, but these on the outside are computer models. So he is really the earliest person to kind of go out and look in the paleontological literature on shells and basically model, here's all the shell shapes that could exist, and then inside the cube is more or less in this black area where we actually find them. So obviously not every computer modeled cube, even according to the core variables he used, was actually found. Nonetheless, he was able to model with some degree of pretty reliability and successful this stuff. And this is really kind of morphospace. We can really go to Raup's work, and you see his early work. You get something that is very geometric, very specific things here, circles, etc. And then the model that's built from it, again, is completely done by the computer method in the beginning. So this is in some ways pre-empiricism, and that's interesting because in Darcy Thompson we also don't have a very clear empirical method, and even in early Raup we don't. But then by 67, this is really solid from my perspective. Viewing it, you have the computer model here on the left, the variables associated with the computer model, and then here in the middle you have basically where these things were actually found. So this is, in here, this is the space where we found within these particular variable constraints things that exist. And then even further here on the right, you have concentrated of specific things like highly ornamented forms, and this has legacy historical value for things too that's in museums, and I was able to model this as well pretty easily. So kind of a pretty clear method, and it's been applied other places. So I'm going to get it back a little bit at the end to sort of where it's applied, where it hasn't been applied, and why. But squamata, for those who don't know, is a general term that encompasses lizards and snakes and other things like that. It's a particular form in evolutionary history. I think this is 240 million years ago. I'm not an expert per se, but you can see we can basically look at the evolution of these things in a time series, which is quite helpful, which forms exist, and basically use a kind of morphospace to kind of plot that, as well as which ones didn't succeed from a sort of evolutionary fitness standpoint. And this second one here, we have the dental version of this. We also have the cranial version of this. So there's a lot of things that we can, in theory, basically plot in this sort of geometric analysis with respect to what we think should exist, what actually did exist, and then kind of so forth. So quite interesting. Now the Levin version particularly here, this is my very crude version here in the middle, so this doesn't come from, this comes from me, but nonetheless you're still having this formula of basically how all of these different planarians kind of can evolve under what circumstances with what auxiliary morphogens and drugs and what sort of shapes come out of it. And I'm going to zip through this. This is partially done for the SEMP people. But one of the interesting things from my standpoint, looking in from the outside, is not only this sort of ion channel mapping, and then this, which is in a 2021 paper about how only a few of the estimated 400 sort of ion channel genes have actually been targeted. So there's still a whole lot of space of effectively research to be done. So in theory, when you're looking at a field like this, you would want to see what hasn't been done yet and where the opportunity space is, as well as what has actually been established. Obviously, this is more or less being stated here explicitly. And then probably things that everyone has seen before, morphogenesis and the Picasso tadpole, the actual anatomical homeostasis, bioelectrical memory, how this sort of thing evolves. The xenobots, and the xenobots are pretty interesting because, again, we have a list of, and this is these pixel models that were different forms of effectively the muscle tissue of the cell, so to speak, versus whatever else that is there that will then cause it to evolve in a particular way and things like that. So we can more or less specify a formal model. We can effectively program these things and then see how they exist and then the variants. And that's something that to a degree exists already now in this xenobot literature, but I'm sure it will evolve considerably. Anthrobots as well. I'm not going to cover things that are covered elsewhere on the internet per se. But then getting in the anatomical compiler, now this is really interesting, not only because it is a specific set of software with a bunch of experiments and morphologies that have been documented, things like that behind it, but also because it has so many implications of what we can do if we are able to effectively know which targeting drugs or a related signal to inject to cause certain outcomes in a fairly well documented way. So this is really, really interesting from this standpoint. Now, to kind of map it at a high level, Bayesian thinking, not something, the most basic version of it does not really require you knowing very much other than you have a hypothesis, you look at new evidence, and then you test it against it, and then you reformulate your hypothesis on the basis of evidence. So it's evolving, it's sort of probabilistic by its nature, because you never have absolute confidence in something, you have a relative confidence. This is a classic model of whether or not, well, Thomas Shy, is he a math PhD or in business school? Well, in math, 75% of the people are shy, whereas in business, only 15%, but there's a lot more people in business school than math, and then overall, it actually ends up, 2/3 probability that he's in business school. So we'll watch the video if you want to go in more depth. But knowledge graphs also are starting to be used in science, also used other places, and they basically have this format. This is a more complicated one, but it's a formal semantics effectively, and there's reasons why people are starting to use it in science, and partially is because they're machine parsable. They can be fed into machine learning models and be used for probabilistic reasoning and sort of discovery, which I'll get into a little bit. And there are cases where just formal semantics make sense. One of the interesting things here is that you can have an LLM discovery mechanism that then comes in, scrapes data, and then basically formats it in this way, which is more or less what I've done as part of this presentation, which we'll see shortly after we go through a few more examples. But this also, as you can see here, does allow a little bit of a nesting function where you can see kind of a whole field, what's been done, where the interactions are, and the rest of it. So this is sort of, for drug repurposing specifically. There's a lot of databases and things like that that are effectively aggregating this sort of information and how, these different systems exist and relate to each other. Then within sort of knowledge graphs and machine learning specifically, now we get kind of path count here. Well, let's just start here actually, sorry. So we're gonna kind of go through with the potential biological relationship, something that already exists, more or less in the same format that we just saw, kind of these interrelated knowledge graphs. And then once you have the data sets that are connected, basically that all have these things, and then we're going to do what this sort of standard random walk embeddings, and then in theory you get these sort of distances, and you can see potentially novel relationships. So that's kind of what is going to be plot out for. We'll see again another version of that for drug discovery specifically, but this is fairly standard. I mean, you also get this other adjacent fields. There's actually quite a number of them, but because there's a little biomedical leaning this presentation, but this is a cybersecurity knowledge graph. Similar principles basically apply there for seeing what sort of things and then being able to learn basically on the basis of them. So this is a knowledge graph. One of the people who sort of I talked to in the last couple weeks related to this is Tobias Kuhn, who has been looking very specifically about knowledge graphs with a kind of immutable record scoping, so that you can get sort of larger scale understanding of science as a whole and how it can be accelerated, including some of the principles and sort of data stuff. So this is his project, basically, nano publications, but it has been getting some adoption, and you get, one of the benefits as well with this sort of ascription technique is that you can kind of drill down. You get this natural sort of nesting function, and then in addition to potentially peer-reviewed, scientific study, you get a specific knowledge graph assertion of what was the finding. So that is helpful sometimes rather than what I have sitting here, which is a stack this tall of 11 lab papers, which is sometimes not that human parsable, frankly, to go through all of them and read them and retain them and the rest of it. So with related to drug discovery specifically, we have, this is pretty recent, frankly. It's the last year or two where you're starting to get more stuff. Maybe there's only like 40 or 50 people in the world that are actually working these probabilistic knowledge graphs right now, from what I could tell, or at least have published on it so far. But it has this really interesting additional feature where you're starting to assess the weight of evidence for a particular assertion, and in a probability way, which then basically, if you're having these typical relations between a disease and a drug, a target, etc., then we're getting the kind of probability of an association between these different ones, and then this can potentially set in sort of this, figure out the new target and the rest of it. So it's kind of recent, but one reason why you might want to do this is probably the only thing I'll say about economics, but it is a kind of important feature of the overall system, as people who are researching on these things have to get paid as well, or the certain types of experiments are costly, and this is the cost to research and develop new drugs according to pharmacoeconomics, in millions of dollars. So, the top line, we're talking about 3 billion range of research for certain types of things. Bottom line, we're talking 100, 200 million. So these CapEx, so to speak, is quite high for getting started in some of these things. And so anything can be done to kind of reduce or understand the space better, likely to cause huge cost savings overall. Now, specific to radical Platonism, we're going to kind of roll up to it. This is very standard kind of Bayesian weight of knowledge thing, which will be even more clear in the next slide once we actually look at a specific example. But we're looking at the probability of something based on the evidence for it, more or less, with any sort of counter evidence. And we've done this sort of breaking this out, kind of parsing, and then all the sort of clear 11 lab hypotheses that have existed. So we have this stuff that was sort of kind of a posterior one, which is more or less its confidence as a percentage. So 97%, 99+%, 88%, and this is sort of going through each more or less thing based on evidence, and have these all broken out. So you don't necessarily need to read them through at this moment, but you can see that there's a range. Basically, mostly highly validated, but according at least to this sort of LM evaluation on the basis of existing thing, some like cancer as a bioelectric network disorder only at 78%. So it's expressing it more or less in a strict quantified way that can be adjusted rather than a strict binary format, which is, I think, one of the issues in some types of reasoning approaches anyways. So yeah, I think we'll find that very useful once we get to radical Platonism specifically. So going through, this is what it looks like in practice. This is in latex format. I have all this stuff as well available, but endogenous bioelectric patterns to encode instructive target morphology. And then, the supporting lines are in green, including the weight of evidence challenges, what might be sort of offsetting that in red. So, and then it also kind of gives you a little bit of nomenclature. Whether or not this would be directly useful, I'm not 100% sure, but within the, for instance, nanopub thing, we can kind of automate it, and it can also be revisited and things like that. So it doesn't force us to have an ultimate final version. But again, here, transient gap junction blockade, rewrite somatic pattern memory, these are two-headed planarians, and then very specifically kind of what the things are for, and then how relatable is it, etc. So we're very, very high confidence for this. Probably no surprise. Real regulative goal-directed error correction to reach morphology. These are the sort of things that are kind of going to lead into the radical Platonism. Obviously, I'm approaching this a little bit from a historical lens, to sort of how we got to the specific claims. So this is, again, just a sort of general evaluation. Obviously, this is going to become more confident the more evidence comes in. Computing and steering gene regulatory networks with downstream anatomical outcomes. Bioelectricity contributes to oncogenesis. This is the one we said before. Cancer, not as clear yet, but obviously something that people have a strong interest in, curing cancer and the rest of it. Anatomical outcomes as attractors in a morphospace. So this is still pretty important and related as we lead in. Bioelectric gradients, gap junction connectivity, um, again, sort of 80 something percent. And then the sort of xenobots, again, we sort of have that pretty well documented. Now, let's go to radical Platonism and see kind of how this relates kind of conceptually. So we have a couple of different ways of sort of modeling this, still kind of within the knowledge graph format. But first is sort of nested sort of hypotheses that kind of roll up, more or less stating this kind of concept. And then assessing the evidence for kind of each thing. So in a way, you can almost see this is like a new version of a syllogism. It might even lend itself to kind of new probabilistic sort of formal logic that is being used. And particularly, it seems like LLMs like to use this. So it could be kind of irrelevant to, in a way, how much the rest of the world starts using this or caring about it. If LLMs start using it, it starts to have very clear and positive sort of outcomes for humanity, since maybe they're sort of naturally suited towards this type of reasoning versus a single binary. Now, this is, again, the same, more or less, writing of the light form of the sort of radical Platonism hypothesis or what have you, claim. And then there's sort of another one that's a more strong version of it. We'll see kind of where we come up with. But this is the endogenous bioelectric patterns encoding instructive target morphology. And then, so this is kind of in the view, again, this is really the LM view, not necessarily my view, but and for the most part, this is a 5 Pro doing these sort of assessments, although I've run it across a bunch of different systems and have the kind of comparative data. But yeah, this is, I think, the kind of pretty well validated according to available evidence. And then this is the strong form. Some sort of biological collective can access or have an ingress from a structured Platonic space of patterns that constrains morphogenesis behavior beyond genes and environment. So this is where we have the, and I think we have an agency kind of issue here, obviously, that is not fully captured in this semantics. Whether it's a sort of bidirectional kind of agency, which sort of implied by the ingress or not, but nonetheless, at like a 23% sort of confidence on the current available evidence. But I'm going to argue this is kind of a good thing in a way because what this model allows is actually people to assess the evidence for a specific claim, however it's structured, with the available evidence. And since we don't necessarily have all of the things as sort of not being directly close to the labs and sort of waiting for the peer-reviewed papers to get published, adding on obviously will allow this. And I think is also a nice offset to some of the things I'm going to deal with in a second, the psychology of decision making, because at various points people snap to pretty strong decisions about things, and Bayesian thinking, even though it is extremely rigorous and preferred in certain fields, also has not penetrated other fields at all. Which I'm going to jump a little bit to kind of a side topic that is, I think, very related, and this it goes back to one of the other people that Darcy Thompson got things from, Albrecht Dürer, who wrote these four books on human proportion in 1528. And he was actually, for the most part, non-normative about the nature of it. He was just documenting what actually existed, humans in all sorts of forms and shapes and sizes, but from a very systematic standpoint. And he did it quite comprehensively. And then we got Schmidt-Huber, on the other hand, who was one of the people who gave me some nice feedback on this presentation so far. And he's kind of making a stronger claim that I'm going to go into a little bit, but more or less that what we see as beauty may be a Kolmogorov complexity in some form, and particularly that, for those who are not familiar, the concept that you have a short program. Effectively, we're living in a computational universe, and there's some sort of computation code that is generating some part of our either cognition or physiognomy, whatever it is, that sort of shorter programs may be somehow recognizable and then correlated with what we see as beauty. So I don't think that's necessarily something we're going to be able to resolve in any fashion, but I think it does relate to some key things that are here. And particularly Darcy Thompson himself, kind of coming a little bit full circle from where I started, but and this is a long quote, but I think it's worth actually sometimes absorbing these things. He says, and one of the reasons basically that in the morphology of living things, the use of mathematical methods and symbols has made slow progress, and there are various reasons for this failure to employ a method whose advantages are so obvious in the investigation of other physical forms. To begin with, there would seem to be a psychological reason lying in fact that the student of living things is by nature and training an observer of concrete objects and phenomena, and the habit of mind which he possesses and cultivates is alien to that of the theoretical mathematician. But by no means is this the only reason. For in the kindred subject of mineralogy, for instance, crystals were still treated in the days of Linnaeus as wholly within the province of the naturalist, and were described by him after the simple methods in use for animals and plants. But after Hauy showed the application of mathematics to the description and classifications of crystals, his methods were immediately adopted and a new science came into being. So he's kind of saying that basically there's a psychological reason that's sort of ingrained in human identity to a degree, and we'll go into another thing that basically that the when we see something that deviates from a sort of mathematical form, that is the identity of the thing, and that is what sort of gives us its value, and to some degree that maps over onto our own appraisal of ourselves, and then we have a little bit of a problem. And so when we can take to something that's inanimate, it's much easier because it's a crystal or whatever, but the thing that's animate actually becomes more and more challenging to sort of navigate this sort of default psychological presupposition. Now, that said, he sort of suggests alternative methodology, and that's part of the reason I'm giving this quote in some length. So he said that a part of this mathematical methods and the suspicion of mathematical methods and organic morphology is due to an ingrained and deeply seated belief that even when we seem to discern a regular mathematical figure in an organism, the sphere, the hexagon, or the spiral, which we so recognize merely resembles, but is never entirely explained by its mathematical analog, in short, that the details which a figure differs from its mathematical prototype are more important and more interesting than the features in which it agrees. Even that the peculiar aesthetic pleasure with which we regard a living thing is somehow bound up with a departure from mathematical regularity, which it manifests as a particular or peculiar attribute of life. This view seems to me a misapprehension. Obviously, he's disagreeing with this, and then he's going to go and say, I'm going to illustrate this by the case of the Earth itself. After the fundamental advance had been made which taught us the world was round, Newton showed that the forces at work upon it must lead to its being imperfectly spherical, and in the course of time its oblate spheroidal shape was actually verified. But now in turn it has been shown that its form is still more complicated, and the next step will be to seek for the forces that have deformed the oblate spheroid. So more or less his claim, and he's a mathematician first and foremost, is that we look first actually at the shapes. Well, first of all, we have to be aware that this psychological bias exists, and particularly people who are not mathematicians, it seems to exist. And second of all, it's fine actually if we take an object, then we show that it sort of deviates from this form and what have you. But then we can see, in process of effectively compounding multiple rule sets, what that deviation is. So you start with Earth is a sphere. Okay, it's not really, but it shows us it's sort of somewhat like a sphere. Then we say it's actually spheroidal, and then we see with this. But actually, no, it's more complicated. So that's an acceptable way to get to that. So interestingly enough, this partially intersects with kind of where we're going to get close to the end here, but this sort of concept of fractals and beauty, which is actually a Levin paper from 1994, and this again, Kolmogorov complexity, the concept of some sort of simplicity of formulas, potentially some energy savings. I know energy is sort of in the research program. So how do we get back to something that is really radically empirical or definitive? Well, I would say it's a bit challenging. This is sort of, particularly when we bring up these other topics, even the psychological things, because we can't totally escape them, being for the most part humans here. So should we shut up and engineer? Well, the response that I think is very fruitful and interesting and provocative here is that our lab mission is not to produce philosophy that is undecidable and will hang out along the long list of ideas that have been kicked around for centuries with no resolution in sight. Engineering, in broad sense, is a critical method for deciding between competing worldviews and frameworks. The best ones are the ones that enable the most fruitful relationships with the world and its diverse levels of agency. So I would say, broadly speaking, I would endorse this and agree with that, but I would also endorse with this sort of caveat that it's a little bit challenging to know what fruitful exactly means in this context. Here we have Kolmogorov, on the left, scribbling some formulas that are more or less related to his idea of sort of algorithmic information theory and complexity. As well as some Schmidt-Gruber stuff, and then these sort of lovely fractals that we may be observing, in fact, in different morphospace that is the sort of empirical version of it, xenobats on the right and the like. Very exciting. But how do we bring it full circle? Well, I'm going to say that one thing that is just very, very clear to me coming out of this research space, and keep in mind I'm not an expert in this specific area, although, like I said, my research intersects with the history of things and sort of database design, is this. Now, this is basically pulled out of this atomical compiler software that is called Planiform, and then more or less that allows us to plot all these different shapes and sizes and interactions. And this is what I have done with a little script. You can actually look at the scripts because everything I use to generate is here on GitHub. But more or less the experiments I've done per year. So these specific things were done, early on in 1898. We have a bunch of things, as well as the sort of publications that have come out on a sort of time series, which has sort of increased more recently as cumulative, but not. But then experiments also have been kind of coming out, and then the publications, and then here you get the sort of cumulative morphology. So we have some steady growth a little bit early, but now we actually have quite a lot of these sort of established morphologies, particularly in this one area. And I think this is a very helpful a way of sort of tying all the pieces together, because as long as we can do this sort of systematically across different things, we at least have the well-documented final version of morphology. So we have something similar for that, I think, with the xenobot literature and things that are coming out, what has actually been observed. We don't necessarily fully have it, at least from what I can tell from outside of the predictive version. What is the possible set of things besides just saying anything in math is fair game? What are the things, all the different ways that xenobots could potentially, and then stating that, and then plotting it against experimental data, something like we saw in the route. So what I'm going to just suggest at the very end is that would be great. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of research being going into it. People on this call know much better than I the details of it, so I won't go in. But predictive morphospace language that cracks a bioelectric code, maybe slightly overstated, but nonetheless, I think that there is something that could be done quite amazingly, that also applies to the multiple of these different permutations of the morphospace. And specifically mapping the bioelectric patterns to the downstream gene expression cascades and morphological outcomes. At the full version, we could see this sort of route type of methodology being super useful. Elucidating the mechanism non-neural memory, not really the focus of this talk, but I think it's something sort of sitting out there that has been still to be decoded to a degree. And then education. So at the beginning, I think we would like to do some sort of seminar under the umbrella of SEMF to educate people, particularly like mid-career professionals and AI or whatever else that are interested in these fields and would like to kind of get into them and see how they intersect. There's quite a lot of people out there that I've just interacted with here and there, as well as the sort of knowledge map doing more formally. Now, one of the things that's also here within this specifically is I was able to take the same database literature and write a script that then was able to put this in the knowledge graph format and in publications. I'm not actually sure if Tobias is on this call. I guess he'll pipe up if he is, but that was definitely an interesting potential intersection point. I have some credits as well. Thanks for various people who've been involved in giving helpful feedback along the way to this, including various academic collaborators. But I know that many of the people who are here and maybe on this call as well are starting their own research institutes that are spin-offs to a degree of existing academic things, or just covering spaces that are not particularly easy to cover in academia for various reasons. And so as a result, I think there's interest in having some formalization of the data format and way to sort of accelerate various of these things, including, I know, Michael, you're part of the California Institute for Machine Consciousness as well. So there's various, and I know you've also presented for Foresight and the rest of it. So yeah, that's that's it for my presentation at the moment. I would love any feedback or questions.
Super, thank you so much. Questions from the audience, please. David, go for it.
Oh, thank you for your fascinating talk. I'd like to go back to the Bayesian hypotheses you had earlier. And as you know, for Bayesianism, the prior probability is a huge thing in determining, where we go with the inference. And I'm wondering if the sort of materialistic hypothesis, let's just say we start on the hypothesis that it's all physics and chemistry, and there's nothing going on mentally. There's no any kind of mental representation going on in cells, that this is all just physics and chemistry. So we start with that as a sort of default position, right? That shapes all of our Bayesian hypotheses, the prior probabilities going forward. So what it means is that the people that have to be convinced to get on board with this are the people that are strongly biased, and again, going back to the bias thing, biased against this, right? So you start out with a program where that is basically the assumption, a materialist assumption. And then you get evidence moving forward from that can then prove these different hypotheses that you're testing.
Yeah, well, 100%. And I think, it's one of the reasons why I sort of oriented, particularly at the end, as the far of things that are, relatively non-controversial, and to a degree, the literature on these topics has been built up from those things where there's either no prior research and no particular reason to doubt a particular thing, when it comes to these lower level things. Whereas the moment you start intersecting where people already have strongly held value or viewpoints, or a term, obviously like Platonism maybe is one that could be considered loaded. It's probably less loaded than other terms. Then you're gonna immediately face that sort of issue that's going to be embedded in it. And I think that overall, the solution that seems the most concrete is to segment the data around as many different things that are sort of as concrete and as hard as possible, so that you can create sort of a momentum in that direction. And then if you ever have to face those things, then hopefully you can do it delicately. But there's I don't know that there's a better solution than that. Maybe if there is, I'm certainly open to hearing it. But
well, no, I think that's the way to go. But I'm just saying, in terms of your priors, I think you had one of the priors was 0.6, right?
mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that people from the materialist perspective might say, well, golly, that's way too high as a prior. I would put my prior at let's say 0.05 or point, very low, right? And then it takes even more mountains of evidence to get that probability up there. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I was gonna deal with this point to a degree, and I'm kind of glad you brought it up, because there's there's interesting possibility within these sort of knowledge graph systems, and for that matter, other semantic data as well. But that's more classic format. But then of having a scriptive layer on top of it that is more or less, here's here's the sort of default version, but here's my version. And to the extent that it's documented, I mean, this is kind of benefit of sort of axiomatic thinking in general. Then you'd say, well, I accept this, but I don't really accept this. How does this change? And you can actually do that somewhat systematically and in a cascading way. How does this affect my view of this particular conclusion if I suddenly start doubting this other thing? And those mental models can be done in some people's heads, but they become progressively more challenging the more, moving parts there are. Um, so I think just documenting them is a good first step, and that's one of the things that I think many people don't realize, and why Bayesian thinking also has had trouble getting off the ground in various places. People don't realize how embedded their priors are without even being able to state what they are. So yeah.
Edwin.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Joel. And of course, I've been chatting to you about this for a while back, and I'm interested in a lot of I have a lot of questions. I'll take one. I'll let other people in. The notion of the morphospace interests me from this perspective of Platonism. Well, I guess one could conceive of a kind of Platonism here that stems from biology as such. These notions of beauty and telos are like they're reminiscent of a kind of a Platonism of a Platonism of life, if you will. And then there's a potential Platonism of something that perhaps physicists would like to hone in on, a Platonism of crude space or matter or something like that. And to me, morphospace, the notion of the morphospace implies, this is just something that's a figure of my imagination when I hear the word, it implies that the biological structures are somehow adapting themselves to a physical substrate. But of course, as far as I can tell, neither of these things are we don't know any of these things specifically with how far we have to go in terms of cosmology and whatnot. But I'm speaking of like priors, I'm curious as to like where do you think we should be? Do you first of all, do you see this sort of discrepancy, and do you think that we're forced to work from one angle or the other, or can we do them simultaneously? Or yeah.
Um, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by a discrepancy in this case, but I mean certainly, with particular respect to this concept of ingress, I would say that there's a challenge in detecting sort of when an ingress has actually happened, and that is something I don't have a very obvious solution to. Uh, Even while taking it as plausible that something like that has happened. And I'm very excited to see the sort of more observable sort of data on these things, sort of as it emerges. I mean, some of the things that I talked about, and obviously other people here on this call know much more about the xenobots or something like that. That's sort of obvious in a way because there's human agency behind it, because humans are partially driving that process, and even these things that that were, and maybe you don't need to include this, but I think a more robust model would, the degree to which we gravitate towards or are interested in a particular set of phenomena is also the degree to which we're going to reproduce it, is the degree to which we're going to have some sort of feedback loop that includes those type of things. And for that matter, that's sort of what art is in a way, that we are sort of reproducing things that we as humans find sort of aesthetically or otherwise interesting. And I don't think that that's a wrong way to do it per se, and I think it could answer many of these things, in the kind of pure form, because I think, for at least my interaction with many mathematicians, is that people really find a natural affinity for this type of thinking, and then that, creates this also sort of feedback cycle. So, I don't know.
And it becomes, yeah, it's very very feedback esque, because it's kind of ironic. You would end up in a situation where if you're going to say that the lab is different from the lab of nature, you already made a metaphysical assumption, so about the involvement of humans making any difference as to the nature of how anything Platonic or form-like would unfold. But which comes back to the whole mind and matter discussion, by the way. But yeah, I'm gonna shut up now.
Great. Anyone else?
Maybe just as a quick note, which is thank you, everyone, and thank you, Joel. I wanted to make a very gentle critique, perhaps opinionated, to the first instance where you mentioned, for example, beauty and how this or its perception can be of relevance or not. Of course, this is very personal, or I mean, it's a segment of, let's say, opinions, um, or yes, or a stance in general. Because in a sense, it's a pattern that is perceived, and it's a very specific category of a pattern, and it relates to perception. And we have been discussing also a lot about how this perception is actually embodied very diversely. And so I would never discard it. But simultaneously, I also wanted to praise a connection you made that I've never made before, which was with the Kolmogorov complexity. For me, I don't know if I have anything of, constructive to say right now about it, but I wanted to praise it because it pings something, and I'm going to think about it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not convinced by it personally. I just thought I would note it because it's sort of out there as one, plausible explanation for certain types of phenomena that we observe. But thank you.
Anyone else? Could I ask maybe a technical question? Just how do you make those the networks that you showed at the beginning with the concepts and having the the prior probabilities and all of that? How do you actually make those?
So the specific ones that were related to yours, I used a few different ways of making them until I got to a solution that I liked. But basically, I set various LLMs to sort of parse all of the papers that were available, and then sort of build it with respect to specific parameters that has the probabilistic knowledge graph format, sort of with the sort of weight of evidence for each sort of sub item. So I gave it a little bit of sort of pre-prompting, and then I specifically told it to do it in LaTeX format because that was what I liked the output of the most for just readability.
Amazing. Okay. All right. Thank you. David.
Yeah, I have one question. I guess it's a minor side point, but at some point in your presentation, you said that LLMs may be reasoning in a different way, sort of that maybe we should embrace. I'm not sure what your point was, that it's a kind of a fuzzy logic. It's an inference that maybe we should embrace. Can you say that again? Because a lot of the research, I've seen a lot of interesting stuff that LLMs are not really reasoning like we are, and they can get things really badly wrong because they don't really understand concepts like we do. They just statistically relate symbols. So can you say that again, what you had in mind there?
Yeah, I've seen the whole range, I think, of LM output. So I've seen some, horrifyingly bad versions and some quite impressive versions, I would say. And, I guess I was leaning towards a positive, although I wouldn't always be that way with the statement I made. But the positives version of it was that, partially for exactly what you were saying before, humans aren't always used to formally naming what their Bayesian priors would be in a particular thing. And yeah, an LLM not only can be forced to do this quite easily, it can find it a sort of natural way of kind of justifying its response, and that makes it sort of inspectable. So, and in that sense, I can have a bunch of LLMs running in parallel, even just the best pro models of the top AI companies of today, as an example of that. And then one of them can give this output, and then I can have it sort of evaluated formally in a way that says, okay, what is your formal assessment of the weight of evidence for this sort of thing? And I think that lends itself, I think, sort of this is open. I guess it's sort of a new topic. Not that many people are working on it per se, but that these type of models, I don't say they prefer it, but it's a sort of natural way for them to kind of be doing the sort of their version of deductive reasoning. And I think from my observation as well as the literature of LMs as they've evolved, that the ones that have been trained more systematically on sort of formal mathematics, some of that has trickled over into a stronger use of deductive logic that sort of bleeds over, and and this is it's close to that. Maybe there's an inductive element to it, whereas in these other forms, it can be very messy. I mean, I've seen all kinds of crazy hallucination stuff, as I'm sure many other people have. So, um,
So, but what you're saying is that at the end of the day, there needs to be a reality check for their output because it could be really crazy, even though probabilistically, with Bayesian reasoning or whatever we're talking about here, it seems good, but it's still radically wrong.
um, it's a good
And
question.
a test is some kind of real thing, like an experiment, right?
Hmm.
Where something really happens or it really doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that's that different from humans, in the sense that they can make either radically wrong hypotheses or radically wrong, conclusions based on that, and then, get themselves in some bind or corner related to that. But yeah, I mean, it certainly can happen. Um, and I think that the degree, we have, this is why I'm hopeful about it, is that we have an iterative process that's easier to improve around these things too. Because if an LLM doesn't work and it fails, we just turn off the electricity or whatever, and then say goodbye, and then the next version comes out in 6 months or something like that. So that version, and we have this already in spades. So if we can have this sort of formal model sort of be baked into various ones of them, and then the ability to introspect and revisit, then you can say, what is your truth model around, such and such characteristics. I mean, and then it's inspectable as well. So you should be able to drill down and see what their sort of it exists. That would be my hope, I would say. Yeah, but I'm hopeful at the moment.
Edwin.
Yeah, so you mentioned, Joe, that some of the people who you are crediting here are interested in starting or have been starting their own institutes. And in this context, I think it begs the question, like we've had these notions of what our disciplines of science are, biology, chemistry, physics, and so on. This was not always the case. It used to be natural philosophy. We all know the drill. And we're in an era where maybe AI, maybe LLMs are going to disrupt the disciplinary boundaries. And I think that has implications for both, I guess, epistemology as such, but also on a more practical level, like how we build universities or yeah, facilities and the aforementioned institutes, maybe more grassroots institutes. So as people, and I think there are more people here like that who are either starting institutes or like interested in doing more science promotion, also on the sort of tactical level of how to organize things. How do you think this case, which is quite a widely spanning case of everything from sort of practical clinical stuff to metaphysics, how do you think this informs how we should go out in the world and try to not disrupt for the sake of disruption, but recreate the academic environments as best we can?
Um, I think something very similar to what I said, with David, where there's things where this stuff is kind of sticky because it's a certain ingrained process around it. And so it's hard to change people's behaviors if they've already been ingrained to think about things. And some things that were set up as social sciences, I'm like, for instance, a big fan of Durkheim and some of these early social scientists to a degree, but, some of the legacy, depending on where you go, doesn't feel so sciencey and so structured today. So I think that there's an opportunity space usually in the areas that haven't been covered. I mean, to a degree, the reason why I'm here today and excited about this project is because it's in a rapidly growing, thing, and just around anatomical compilers alone, I can see, this giant, vast world of possible things that could be done, and that excites me, and it excites me even more if it's something that creates a sort of infrastructure behind it that then is extensible to other, let's say, new fields of knowledge as they emerge. And there's things that are just known, where academia has a challenge in doing it. Some of it's just because of something new. The book I just wrote for MIT Press was on history of crypto cypherpunk movement, basically cryptocurrency, prior cryptography, and things like that before. And these people basically didn't work with the academic world at all because they thought email lists were enough. And people like Wei Dai, who's I think quite prominent philosopher, at least was in certain rational circles now, he basically said, I think we can do peer review as well as the rest of everything, particularly when it comes to these sort of formal mathematics. We don't actually need academic institutions. So I think that was a common feeling in certain of these sort of social groups that percolated, let's say, on the deep web. And to a degree percolated to the point where it created a very significant social upheaval in a way. But so I don't know, I would just look for the opportunity areas where there's not a necessary conflict as well. Personally, I don't have a strong bias against academia in any particular thing. I just think that there's room for innovation.